Hey guys, it's Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. Welcome to our new discussion series of Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. We just finished up the 18 upbuilding discourses. It was kind of a Herculean effort. I'm really proud that we were able to get through all of that. And now we're taking up what I consider to be the skeleton key to almost all of Soren Kierkegaard's authorship. That's not to say that it renders everything else superfluous, but I think it's a great orienting book, and I want to proceed through it with great detail, and I want to develop a lot of these ideas slowly. Before I start to do that, I want to turn it over to Robert and see if he has anything that he would like to say before we get into the text today.
Oh, well, just hello to everybody. This work is it's not a large work, but it's certainly a thought-provoking work, especially for a Christian. To read this, there's a lot of things that I think that will appeal to a believer who's just not satisfied with maybe the traditional, more superficial idea of Christianity. Someone who's looking for something deeper, looking, to put a little bit more meat on the bones. As we talked the last time, looking for the adult version of the gospel. I think Kierkegaard is just scratching the surface right here. So I'm excited to begin this work. I think we can really help one another in this work as we approach it.
Yeah. This is one of those philosophy texts that really stuck with me, kind of turned things inside out for me. And I think people will see that as we go along with it. So let's just jump right into a little bit of the background information for it. And my resources for this are a combination of Wikipedia, and also there's a really wonderful website, Robert. I don't know if you've ever encountered it. It's sorenkierkegaard.org. It was put together by a gentleman who I believe is now deceased, D. Anthony Storm's commentary on Kierkegaard. Do you ever visit that website? Do you like it?
Yeah, actually, about 5 years ago, I think I ran into it, and I communicated to him through emails.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I do have a little bit of insight into what he was doing and his background, and so I did run into that. So this is the first time I've ever heard about this. I love his website. Is there anything you can say about your relationship with him? What motivated it or anything like that? Because I think it's something that people that are interested in Kierkegaard visit. Is there anything? Well, actually, the coincidence was I ran into him on a Greek website that it was a website designed to help people to learn and share what they know about Greek. And he was on there, and I just kind of ran into him there and then ran into his website on Kierkegaard. And he really doesn't live that far from me. He only lives down in Davis, which is probably about less than an hour away from me. And I think it was interesting because I think he graduated with a degree in French literature, something a little bit kind of away from the path here. I don't know a lot about his personal life or anything like that because it was kind of a short-lived communication. I kind of went on to other things, and so did he. So I never really did get to meet him or talk at length with him about Kierkegaard. But it was when he was just beginning to start his website. So it wasn't as robust as it is now. I did visit it recently, and it's a lot more robust than it was when we began.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but I discovered this not too long ago when I was looking at the site that he passed away on March 7th, 2012 from brain cancer.
Oh, did he?
His name was Dan Anthony Storm, and I believe his wife, Nancy, continues to run the site. And at the time, he wrote in his biography, I have it right here, I have a BA in French with minors in Latin and Greek and have completed the course work for a PhD in classical studies from CUNY, but my knowledge of Kierkegaard is largely self-taught from decades of reading. I am an amateur in the best sense of the term. An amateur is, after all, one who indulges in something for the love of it, By trade, I'm a web developer. I am responsible for all content and coding except as mentioned above, and hold the copyright for all except for quoted material. Which is interesting. I think the fact that he is self-taught will feed into our discussion about some of the themes in philosophical fragments today about where we learn knowledge and who can be the occasion for knowledge. But I think it's kind of nice. We inadvertently have memorialized him here. I think he's done a wonderful service because what he had done is he had gone through almost all of Kierkegaard's works and had at least something to say about all of them.
Yeah, he has a lot of quotations from Kierkegaard as well. And one of the strengths, one of the purposes of his original website was to help people who thought they remembered Kierkegaard saying something somewhere, and then they would send him an email and he would tell them which book it was in and where to find it. So
yeah,
that's a pretty good talent. I can't remember where I remembered a lot of things I heard from Kierkegaard myself. So that's a service in and of itself.
Yeah, it's interesting how things can develop like that. And in some ways, I would say like he was a bit of an inspiration for the Noetic project. And if anyone is interested in the Kierkegaard being a quotable figure, I can recommend people should check out Gordon Marino's. He runs the Kierkegaard Research Center up at St. Olaf, and he had a book called The Quotable Kierkegaard, where he just assembles a bunch of Kierkegaard quotes. Mm-hmm. And what's really funny about that, a lot of people don't know this, and I have no idea if Gordon listens to this, but Gordon is also a boxer, and through the years has grown close with Mike Tyson. And apparently Mike Tyson, through the relationship with Gordon, has developed an interest in Kierkegaard.
Really? Well,
yeah. What a small world, right?
So he might be listening to us right now then, huh? We better be careful.
Yeah, no. If Gordon is listening, he's an awesome dude, and he gave me a slot as a Kierkegaard scholar up there one summer. And they have a great program up at St. Olaf. And I highly recommend all of those that are interested in Kierkegaard checking it out. It's a summer program. You can learn Danish and you can do close readings. A lot of the stuff that Robert and I do here, I feel like some of the techniques, the close reading is in part influenced by my time spent there. So, hopefully you think highly of what I do and what Robert does, and, and you'll check out St. Olaf. It's a great resource. So anyhow, I think those are helpful digressions, but we should get back into it. Yeah. So I think we should say a little something about this text in question. All right. So this is part of Soren Kierkegaard's PolyOnimous authorship, meaning in his first authorship, he had a direct signing authorship, and he had a pseudonymous strain as well. And this one falls within the pseudonymous strain. This was ultimately attributed to the pseudonym Johan Clematis. And I'll have something to say about that in a second. But like many of other Soren Kierkegaard's works, he did put himself down as the publisher of it. So, I mean, I don't think there were a lot of individuals who were under any false illusion that Kierkegaard wasn't behind this when it came out on June 13th in 1844. What's really interesting and what's so cool about this book, and I don't think you and I intended to do this at the time, is that it came out 9 days after the 3 Upbuilding Discourses of 1844, which of course you all know if you've been following along our 18 Upbuilding Discourses seminar. That's absolutely incredible. Like that he would release those 3 discourses and this 9 days later. Did you know that, Robert?
No, but I have a note here also. It says on the same day that the concept of dread or the concept of anxiety was also published.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I couldn't imagine doing all that in such a short time frame, having all that ready to go. So yeah, he certainly was prolific.
I really want to say the concept of anxiety more closely. I feel like that might be just it holds so many treasures when thinking about Kierkegaard's Christian existentialism. I've mentioned this before in other conversations. It's one of the few philosophy books I just keep listening to over and over and over again, and I get new things out of it. And I really want to do a line-by-line dissection of it one day. Maybe we'll do it after Philosophical Fragments. Maybe it would make sense to do it since they released them on the same day.
Yeah, I'd love that. That book is so steeped in psychology, which is unusual because he touched so many different areas of study, theology, psychology, philosophy, poetry. I mean, he just touched so many different ones. Each work is amazing.
Yeah, it really is. It's interesting. When I was doing just like a cursory sort of internet search of Philosophical Fragments, how much Kierkegaard's work just gets categorized as psychology and not necessarily philosophy. I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if you came across that. I was like, man, no one knows where to categorize this guy.
No, right. That's right.
Yeah. So what is also interesting is that this pseudonym, Johan Clematis, it's not just Philosophical Fragments that Johan Clematis is ascribed to have written. Kierkegaard, after Philosophical Fragments, he released a book called Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments, which I can't help but laugh because the Philosophical Fragments, depending on the edition you're using or whatever, is like, I don't know, like 70, 80, 100 pages long, depending on how it's structured or bound or whatever. And if anyone's ever seen the Concluding Unscientific Postscript, it's like massive. So you think of a postscript, it's like a PS, see you at the basketball court or whatever. This is the most expansive postscript I've ever seen. Have you read the Concluding Unscientific Postscript?
No, not yet. Not yet. But I plan on doing that as soon as we get a little bit of a break, or at least until that's our next assignment anyway.
Yeah. Well, maybe that would make sense to follow Philosophical Fragments up with, because it does develop these ideas further. It's kind of a reiteration of them. There might be some new stuff there. It's been a while since I've looked at it. And then what's also really interesting is that there's a work that was never really properly released called Johan Clematis. And I don't know a lot about that one. That's one that I've never read. It seemed, the little that I know about it, it seems disorganized in some way, but I can't really say that I've spent any time with it. Do you know anything about it, Robert?
No, I've never seen it in the bookstores or a library. Is it translated into English? Because all of his works weren't, right?
I think it eventually made it into English. I believe I do have a copy of it somewhere. It's in that Hong collection. It did make it out there, but it is kind of a forgotten work. And now I want to take that one up. So, gosh, it looks like we've got a full plate here for the next 6 months or so. All right. Okay. And just to give us a little bit so we can get a little bit of a sample of some of the themes that we're going to be talking about in Philosophical Fragments, it's broken down into 5, or I believe 7 major sections. And today we're going to be talking about, we're really just going to be talking about the first third of the first section. It's called A Project of Thought. The second section is The God as Teacher and Savior, an essay of the imagination. The third section is The Absolute Paradox of the Offended Christian. Then there's an appendix, The Paradox in the Offended Consciousness. Then The Case of the Contemporary Disciple, interlude, and The Disciple at Secondhand. I took pretty careful notes on this book like 5 years ago when I first read it, and I started to prepare for today, and I was like, I just started taking notes all over again. I realized I'm taking even more careful notes this time around. So we're not gonna cover a ton of terrain today, but we're gonna go slow, and we're gonna start to develop some of the ideas. I do want to say something a little bit about the pseudonym Johan Clematis and what are some of the themes that he deals with in this book, in Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments, and Johan Clematis, the book itself. I got this from Dan Storm's site, and I thought it was really helpful. Do you want to jump in and say anything, Robert, before I give us a little background on the pseudonym?
No, go right ahead. I'll jump in when I need to.
I debated. I thought about just taking my own notes and kind of, but I really liked what Dan did on his site, and I just kind of ripped 2 paragraphs from it, and then Robert and I can kind of discuss these 2 paragraphs. I think it's I don't think it's going to be a problem for me to read them directly, and so here I really appreciate the fact that Dan did this research on the pseudonym. Here it goes. Okay, Kierkegaard took this name from a Greek monk, 570 to 649, who was the abbot of St. Catherine's of Alexandria on Mount Sinai. He was the author of the work Climax to Perditio, translated in Latin as Scala Perdisi, or Ladder of Paradise, climax being the Greek for ladder. Generally, was the first book to be printed in the New World, translated into Spanish, Mexico, 1532. Climax's work was written for a monastic audience. He says that no one should attempt the contemplative life without first warring against and subduing the passions. The latter is thus a series of 30 steps which ultimately lead to impassibility and imperturbability, not entirely unlike the ataraxia of the Epicureans, except that Epicureans seek to escape the troubles of the world for quiet contemplative pleasure, while Climacus strove for the heavenly vision. As the Imitation of Christ is one of the most popular devotional works outside of the Bible in the West, the latter has long achieved the same importance in the East. It is read every Lent in Orthodox monasteries and is appointed to be read aloud in church or in. For Kierkegaard, the pseudonym Johan Clematis represents the subjective approach to knowledge. Though this Climacus is not a believer, the latter is not then the ascent to God, but is meant to call to mind an ascending series of logical plateaus, where the logician represented particularly by Descartes and Hegel proceeds from one premise to the next. Johann rejects this method in spiritual matters, thinking it ridiculous to approach the absolute in any way except through faith. He is concerned with subjective knowledge and with the leap. Though Johann is no Christian, he leads the reader up to the point by which he can make a decision. Objective knowledge, which is the avowed goal of rational philosophers, is impossible to appropriate by subjective creatures. Thus, Kierkegaard was concerned with knowledge that would encourage the soul to turn to God. But again, Johann claims not to be a Christian, since he has not yet reached that knowledge of God. The rigorous ascent to God towards impassibility has been replaced by the very passionate and subjective approach to truth, whereby the believer, by virtue of the absurd, finds himself before Christ. So, I mean, Dan, in that description of the pseudonym of Johan Clematis, gave us a great hint of what is to come in philosophical fragments. Now, there's a lot of language, a lot of terms there that we will unpack as time goes on, but I thought that was kind of interesting. I'd never heard of this old monk that Kierkegaard took the pseudonym from. Did you know anything about the original Johan Clematis?
Yeah, actually, I read something in one of the commentaries on Kierkegaard on his works when I was looking up to get do a little more background on the pseudonymous names, and I ran into that. Yeah, and I thought that was kind of interesting. But I don't know if it really pertains directly to this. I mean, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a background, but I'm not sure that it's a one-to-one connection between the idea of going, up the steps and so forth. This doesn't seem to be to me when I read the work. I didn't make that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd probably be an interesting paper or subject to research in and of itself. Just seeing like how close Kierkegaard's pseudonyms are to the things that he's trying to say. I imagine, some pseudonyms I can imagine were chosen with greater care than others. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe some of the pseudonyms he agonized over just as, intensely, and they all have, like, maybe there's a story behind he selected every pseudonym that's that would be engaging. Maybe someone should write that book one day.
Well, in general, why, I'm not sure that our audience is familiar with the idea of why did Kierkegaard use a pseudonym and not simply say Soren Kierkegaard and sign it by his name. And I think that background might be helpful here. Do you want to go ahead and discuss that a little bit, what you know about it?
Yeah, I mean, there are limitations to what I can know, right? Because I think maybe we should both try to weigh in on this matter, because I think the reasons for why Kierkegaard develops a pseudonymous strain in his authorship are manifold. I mean, I think a big part of it, at least one reason for why he does it, a big part of it is to get the individual to try on a certain sort of life perspective, an existential stage, and to illuminate its virtues, all that glimmers and glitters about it, but also to see the point at which it inevitably ends up in existential bankruptcy if it is outside of faith. And what we've gotten from Dan's commentary, we know that Johan Clematis, at least as Kierkegaard has appropriated his name for this discourse, is going to be someone who's very familiar with everything that's going on in philosophy. He's going to be the philosopher that has all this incredible objective knowledge, and he's going to have a great understanding of Christian doctrine and theology. But he tiptoes up to being a Christian and kind of demonstrates that it's not enough to be able to recite all the dogma and doctrine in the world, that there's going to be something else, and that maybe Johan Clematis is not quite there yet. Maybe you want to think about it, as Johan Clematis ascending to the ultimate apex of knowledge, but is unable to jump off of it. He can get to that climax, but he can't take that ultimate leap of faith. He only has intellectual knowledge of faith. So, I mean, I think that's one reason I think Kierkegaard may have used this pseudonym to show the limitations of speculative philosophy. I think that's, at least for this text, and other pseudonyms showed the limitations of aesthetic life points of view and ethical life points of view. But I think that's a big reason why Kierkegaard uses pseudonyms. What would you say, Robert?
I would add to that a little bit, and then you're right on target, especially as far as this work goes. One of the reasons I think he did it is because his approach to the public. If he would have approached them under his own name with the criticisms of what was going on in the church in Denmark, people would have done what people usually do when they're criticized. They would have pushed back, put the book down, not bothered to read it, not even purchased it. But
right.
The way he uses these different personas, he's able to discuss the issue with them and still be critical without being offensive. And I found that an excellent way, not only for him, but for my approach to other people. I've tried to learn from this. And so when I meet somebody who doesn't agree, the first thing I try to do is listen to them. I try to listen to their argument and say, okay, what do you have to say? Now, I'm not going to be critical, but what if this is true? Let's go with this statement. If this is true, then this may be true. And I kind of take them down the same path that Kierkegaard takes us down in this work, where he listens to the argument and he says, well, Socrates, you got a good idea here, but let's look at it. What happens if it's not true? What's the consequences? And so I learned a lot from his idea of using these pseudonymous names, that we don't always have to turn everything into an argument. We can criticize indirectly, which is what he was trying to do through these pseudonymous names.
Yeah, I think Kierkegaard is teaching us a lot via example, the art of seduction. I think Kierkegaard, really, yeah. Kierkegaard, I think about, today's election day, right? And no one, Robert, I don't know about you, man, but I don't think I've ever convinced anyone to my point of view by walking them through it logically. People oftentimes, and he'll say this in other places, people believe what they want to believe, not necessarily because it's like a matter of logical necessity, but because it's an act of will. Mm-hmm. And I think what Kierkegaard does through the personas and different pseudonyms or whatever is I think maybe it gets people to drop their defenses so they are open to new ideas. It's kind of maybe it's a little bit like a Trojan horse or something like that. Like if you're like, hey, he's saying, he's like, oh, I'm not a Christian or whatever, and I never could really tell you how you could feel about this, but he leads you up to that point. Like you're so close. Like, mm-hmm. I mean, you're closer than you ever would have before. Like you're closer than you would have been had you encountered some manic street preacher with a bullhorn trying to like say, repent or die, but if he has this character that's like familiar with all worldly philosophy, well, you might take it in, you might spend some time with it. You might find yourself seriously entertaining it. And who knows, you may abandon a previous belief for something else.
I think in one of his works, he did admit that he was being a little deceptive by using these pseudonyms, but he justified it as saying it's through these pseudonyms that I can lead people to the truth. And so this is kind of how he justified it.
The ends justify the means, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess I would raise the interesting question is if you and I have been brainwashed as the result of reading Kierkegaard.
Maybe.
Well, at the very least, it's a very effective mechanism for showing us how brainwashing can work.
and from this work, we'll realize that even if we were brainwashed, we wouldn't be able to know it. So
it's funny. All right, so let's jump into the preface here. Unless you have anything else you want to say, and there are many other reasons why Kierkegaard wanted to use the pseudonyms, but I think what you and I said there were some of the better known reasons. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say anything else before we get into the meat and the potatoes?
I'm ready for the text.
All right. So, I got this preface here, and in my original notes, I had totally looked over the preface, and I think that was probably bad because I think there's something good in here. So I'm going to just I didn't really have a chance to rehearse what I was going to teach today, so I'm just going to kind of read you what I was able to jot down late last night as I was tossing and turning over election coverage. So he says in the preface that the present offering is just a piece. It's not part of his time's philosophical movement. And something that we have to understand about the time within which Kierkegaard was writing was a time when systematic philosophy was very in vogue. Specifically Hegelianism and all the sort of acolytes of Hegel. So there was a great drive within philosophy for people to complete the Hegelian system, to come up with an alternative to the Hegelian system. Everything had to be complete and explained. And Kierkegaard could masterfully understand all these different sort of philosophical outlooks, but he found something really vacuous and empty about them. Have you studied any other sort of philosophers from that time? Have you studied people like, I don't know, Schlegel or Schleiermacher or anyone else? Or I mean, I know I have some background in Kant, but those other figures I haven't had time to get into those other thinkers.
I've ran into them and I've read a little bit about them, but never really studied. I have a list of some of the names that were given in one of the documents that were right on target here. So I'll just read this list in case anybody out there is familiar with it. Lessing was one of them, Leibniz, Immanuel Kant, Schleiermacher, and Hegel, and Feuerbach. Those are the ones that I have listed here that kind of bought into this Socratic idea of truth, and eventually which became Hegelianism, I guess. But they all had their own little different ideas of it, but it all pretty much came out to the same thing, that about the speculation, which you'll be getting into as far as historical truth versus speculative truth and so forth. But yeah, they all kind of had their own version of it. And it was an interesting thing about Hegel said that the highest form of religion is Christianity, and the highest form of philosophy is, guess what, Hegelianism.
Well, yeah. That was the interesting thing when I was putting together my dissertation project, studying a lot of Hegel, and we've done a little bit of Hegel for the Noetic app. Graham Schuster and I did the preface essay from the Science of Logic, which I think it's called "With What Must the Science Begin?" But I really love Hegel's approach. I admire it, but this is the thing about me and philosophy, is that like I view philosophy, I view philosophical systems as like art forms. I don't like eternal happiness, and we'll talk more about this, doesn't like rise and fall with it. Like I just find them, I view them like symphonies or beautiful works of art, and I love like figuring them out. But it ultimately doesn't determine how I live my life or whatever. And this is the Kierkegaard influence, which will come out. But something that, when I was preparing my dissertation topic, I was looking at Kant and Hegel and Kierkegaard and how they approached or embraced Christianity, and they all did it in their own weird way. Because and I loved Hegel's because he tries to account for all religion, or he tries to account for all art or all epochs of history. He's got this grand totality, and it's a really beautiful thing. But there's a lot of disagreement themselves. Maybe that argument has been decided. I don't know what the status is of Hegelian research. Is that after Hegel died, there were all sorts of people that were competing to take up his torch, and there were the left Hegelians, the center Hegelians, and the right Hegelians. There were those Hegelians that viewed Hegel as a Protestant St. Thomas Aquinas, and then there are a lot of other people that view him as the exact opposite, that view him as a forerunner to Marx, and that he was into Marxism before even Marx was. It's very strange. But I ultimately ended up doing Kierkegaard because there was no doubt in my mind that Kierkegaard honestly believed in the Christian truth, whereas I couldn't really say that about Kant and Hegel. It seemed like there was at least a 50% chance that they were using Christianity to either for political reasons or to further their careers or whatever else. I couldn't really tell if they were sincere in their purported support for Christianity. And this debate rages. So I don't want anyone to view what I say here about Kant and Hegel as authoritative. It certainly is not. And it's highly, highly controversial about what they really thought.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way you put it, that you look at philosophy in an artistic manner. And I think that might partially work for me as well. But what I've learned through studying different philosophers is that it's unfair to criticize them until you actually sit down and read their own works and try to understand them in their own works. Then I think you can see their weaknesses, the real weaknesses of their philosophy. When you start listening to what everybody else tells you about them, it's unfair to them. Plus, I think you've already created a resistance to what truth they do have to offer. Because I think that even if I don't care for Hegel, I think he says things that are really good and that we can learn from them and kind of put them in the little truth bag. This sounds good. I think I'll bring this along with me. as well as almost every other philosopher. I think they've all almost like, we're talking about Climacus going up the rungs of the ladder, you know. Some of them have maybe gone up a couple of rungs, and they have something to offer us. So I don't always resist them. I'd rather listen to what they have to say. Of course, people like Kant are a little difficult to understand in their own words. Sometimes you have to have somebody else help you out because they're just so obscure and difficult to understand. But
well,
anyway,
that's what the Noetic app is for, right? And that's what we're here to help other people with. And you know, we try to just not insert too much opinion as we do this. There was one thing I wanted to ask you about when you sort of said that systematic philosophers were an expansion of like kind of the Socratic perspective. And there's something I wanted to say about that. To be fair to Socrates, I think it might be hard to say what truly is the Socratic perspective because we don't know precisely where Socrates ends and Plato begins. And this, I guess I would want a clarification for why you associate them with the Socratic idea. I guess all I'm saying here is that at least Kierkegaard loves Socrates. In this text, he tries to put a little distance between him and Socrates, but like it seems like that if Kierkegaard could have a round table of like the most interesting people that ever lived, Socrates would definitely be there. I think it's there in the concept of irony or whatever. I think the question becomes is Socrates a negative figure who kind of critiques what humans can know, or is Socrates someone who Plato used as a puppet to advocate his own program? So I just wanted to make that distinction in case people hadn't really thought about it. You know, Socrates didn't write anything down. Plato was his scribe. And then at some point, Plato kept using Socrates as a figure within his own philosophy. And that is highly controversial within philosophy about what we can authentically attribute to Socrates. Usually the five dialogues, which we'll talk a little bit about today, like that's definitively like that. People are pretty settled on that being Socrates, but I don't know. Maybe some of the stuff I'm getting out of my depth, but not everything is like Socrates said this and Plato said this. It's a little blurry.
Do you think that Kierkegaard opens up with the theory of recollection? The reason I related it to Socrates is because it's only that one narrow statement that he makes. So this one narrow portion of Socrates' philosophy, the theory of recollection. Would you attribute that to Socrates? Because that's what Kierkegaard did. And maybe my error is indirect, but
yeah. I mean, it does come from the Meno, which would be in the five dialogues. Yeah. I mean, I'm tempted to say that's probably more of a Socratic doctrine, and I want to build up to it. I think the question would be, what is, is that a pretty simple and innocuous thing to then get from like, oh, well, we have this like crazy power to understand all of the truth that should be for God alone, right? Like the idea for Hegel is that like he can somehow like, understand, like he can understand it all, right? That he can have the knowledge that is in eternity through that sort of philosophical introspection. Like would Socrates have approved of it going that far? And that, that's a massive discussion. I maybe, and I don't know if we should get too mired in it, but I think I think we're just kind of raising some concerns about it. Yeah. And but let me say a little bit more about the preface before we get into this doctrine of recollection that Robert mentioned. So Johan Clematis or Kierkegaard in this piece says that he's not a helper for these systematic philosophical movements. If anything, he seems to sow confusion, considers whether or not it would have been better for him to keep quiet. He's standing in the way of a lot of this systematic philosophical progress by articulating a lot of the problems he's going to articulate in the philosophical fragments. And he asks himself openly in the preface, like, is he serving the public good? Is he merely serving himself? And ultimately, Johan Clematis comes down and says he does not think there is any epic making significance to his work. He doesn't think that the philosophical fragments is going to be this world historical text. It's not going through the streets with drums and pans being like, look what I have done, look what I have done. It's going to be something more subtle. And maybe it has maybe because it is more subtle and maybe it has more of a life, we're talking about Kierkegaard 200 years later, and you had to read off that list. I don't know how many people are reading Feuerbach or however you say his name, or Schlegel or people like that. A lot of these people who thought they had apprehended the truth of it all, they kind of seem like philosophical has-beens, but I think that would not do them that would be not treating them correctly. We need to go back and take their views very seriously one day. But I think a lot more people understand who Kierkegaard is and his significance than they do any of those other figures. Some of those figures you read off have enduring significance, obviously Leibniz and Kant and Hegel himself, but others not so much. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. He didn't want to be thought of as one of those philosophical movement makers. What I felt was really, do you remember the analogy he used? He talked about maybe like comparing himself to like the clowns in the circus that like do these tricks over and over again, but then like they're ultimately supplanted by other people who can do the same tricks. Like eventually they just keep doing the really crazy tricks, and then they're sort of aged out of it, and then someone else does it too. Like it seems like it's just a bunch of tricks.
Yeah, and I guess as though the individual doesn't really matter. It's the idea of the clown, right?
Yeah, or the circus to be entertained. Like, congratulations, like you managed to keep your life was in service to the system. It's like, I don't know, maybe it's like saying congratulations, you were one of life's clowns. You kept the public distracted for a short period of time while you were on Earth.
Yeah, well, I think our generation, and many generations have proven that is the status quo. Everybody just wants to be entertained. Don't make me think. Don't make me think too deeply, especially about myself. Distract me from all this. And Kierkegaard, throughout a lot of writings, uses that approach, doesn't he? About the distractions of the world and how we are taken away from thinking anything provocative because it's not fun all the time. We need fun.
Well, but this is just the thing, is that, I can tell you this, like reading Hegel is not fun. Hegel, it's not fun. But, and if you do find it fun, you're kind of twisted like me, I guess. But what I'm trying to say here is that it's not like, I guess what Kierkegaard is trying to say when he's critiquing the systematic philosophers is that they're on a par with all of those other sorts of individuals that just merely entertain us, be they circus performers or Beyonce or Lady Gaga or whoever else. I think Kierkegaard is concerned with us getting caught up in that sort of reflective objectivity that don't progress further, that we just get kind of trapped. Now, I don't think Kierkegaard would say that kind of distraction is the same. Like, I don't think he would say that gorging ourselves on pizza is the exact same as like reading Hegel's theories of history or something like that.
Mhm.
But they do prevent us from perhaps developing something. So I just want it is a form of distraction. I think is what he's trying to communicate here in this preface.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kierkegaard says he just wants a peaceful, or Johan Clematis says he just wants a peaceful reception of this work and hopes that someone can draw something from it. This issue of his personal opinion. He feels like people really want to know where he falls on a lot of the things that he takes up. That no one would ask him this question, what his personal opinion was. He thinks his opinion is ultimately useless and that he has no comfortable opinion. And I'll quote him from Philosophical Fragments. I have disciplined myself and keep myself under discipline in order that I may be able to execute a sort of nimble dancing in the service of thought, so far as possible also to the honor of the God and for my own satisfaction. For this reason, I have had to resign the domestic happiness, the civic respectability, the glad fellowship, the communion bonorum, which is implied in the possession of an opinion. It doesn't seem like he's interested in imposing a certain point of view. It seems like he just wants to go as far as thought will take him and no more. He doesn't want to be heavy-handed in the influence. He doesn't want that responsibility. I think part of the reason why he may not want that responsibility is that it's okay for himself to get caught up in philosophical reflection and to take one view this way or something like that. But I think he recognizes that the responsibility for other people's eternal happiness is so great that he wouldn't want to get it wrong. It seems like there's almost this superstition that if he imposes his opinion, he might be in some way responsible for other people falling away from God or not relating to God correctly. He'd rather just kind of lead them as far as thought can go. What was your take on that?
What I took from that is I saw a little bit of Kierkegaard coming through there. Sometimes you can almost tell from his other works, whether it's Kierkegaard actually talking to us or whether it's the synonymous author. What I got from this is that Kierkegaard didn't want to create Kierkegaardians, so that there's a whole lot of Kierkegaardians running around, carrying around philosophical fragments, under their arms. But he wanted to bring us to a point where we could accept faith. And if anything, maybe carrying Bibles with us or something. He wanted to bring us to a higher level of understanding God and ourselves. And all this other stuff, as I said before, even these guys like Hegel and that, they're intermediate steps, hopefully, to that end result. Kierkegaard is just kind of trying to get us there more directly and quicker to that moment, which he uses, to the moment of faith, where we discover who we are in the eyes of God. And so that's what I think he's building up to that in here, as well as a lot of other works.
Yeah, totally. I love the fact that you mentioned Kierkegaardians, about brainwashing and stuff like that. I mean, obviously, given our limited resources and whatnot, we have a lot of stuff on the Noetic app about Kierkegaard. You could maybe say that, and I've made this joke elsewhere. People sometimes call me Lukaguard because I do so much Kierkegaard work. It's what I know. It's what I have around me. It's what I'm working on right now. Kierkegaard is one of those thinkers who didn't want to turn himself into an idol and knew that people could be turned into idols and turn themselves into these rock star philosophers or whatever. But I mean, ultimately he didn't want to make it. And I'd say, and why he used the pseudonyms. is he didn't want to make it about himself, because if he made it about himself, then people would view him as sort of a intermediary between him and Christ, as if they needed Kierkegaard to get to Christ, and that would be an elevation of himself that, as we'll see here in the Project of Thought, that he would have been very uncomfortable with, because that would have meant have had a greater role than Socrates or any teacher, and would have started to approximate, Christ's role, which we'll get in much later. And so there's this tension, right? Like, Kierkegaard doesn't want to be idolized, but he is idolized by so many people because he is so pure in how he gets us to the truth. People really have great affection for him, and it's a bit of a difficult balance to hold someone in such high esteem, but not to idolize them. So, I don't know. I mean, do you feel that tension at all? Does that bother you at all? I mean,
it doesn't bother me, but I guess I do feel that I'm drawn to Kierkegaard. I mean, of all the people that I've read, I'm just drawn to his works. I do love Kierkegaard. He has opened my eyes to so many things, and for me, he's so important because he's my source of that adult version of the gospel. He's the only source that I've found that can speak to that desire that I have for more. I don't get that anywhere else in Kierkegaard. So I wouldn't call myself a Kierkegaardian, but I guess I'm as close to it as I can probably get.
I don't know what that makes us. And I think that'd be an interesting psychological exploration to come right as close as you possibly can to idolizing someone. It's very interesting. This whole preface, it reminded me of, I don't know if you've read Nietzsche's Thus Speaks Zarathustra. I don't know. Have you read that at some point?
No, I have not read that.
Yeah, it's been a while, and I really wish Kierkegaard and Nietzsche could have been friends. They are so similar and so different at the same time. But one of the things, if memory serves me correctly, about Thus Speaks Zarathustra, like they end up, he's kind of enlightening them, and like people start falling down and worshiping him, and he's like, "What are you doing?" like this goes against everything I've been saying. So, I think Kierkegaard may have anticipated people's tendency to turn him into a bit of an idol here. And what's interesting is that, Kierkegaard has his own idols. I've mentioned, he's going to try to he's going to try to reduce Socrates' role, but I expect that, he'll say here that, Socrates was just an occasion, but I think at least at this stage of my life, I tend to think that Kierkegaard held Socrates in very high esteem too.
Yeah.
How we view Kierkegaard, I think Kierkegaard viewed Socrates.
Yeah, I would say that. I think we hold him in high esteem, and nothing wrong with that, having a good teacher. I think the church held Paul in high esteem. If you want to look at different, try to relate this to other characters. Yeah. I mean, just because we like Paul and we read his works and we love what he says doesn't mean we're replacing Christ with Paul. There's room for people that could just help us and build us to a point that help us to understand Christ better.
Yeah. All right, well, let's jump into this first chapter. I'm really only going to get through the first section. It's called A Project of Thought, A. And as Robert alluded to earlier, it begins with a question, a Socratic question. And how far does the truth admit of being learned? So I asked myself, well, why is that a Socratic question? And Johan Clematis gives us this. He says, it was a Socratic question, or it became such in consequence of the parallel Socratic question with respect to virtue, since virtue was again determined as insight. Protagoras, Gorgias, Meno, Euthydemus. So I guess a big part of what Socrates was trying to do was not can the good, can the virtuous be learned? And it runs parallel to that to ask, how far does the truth admit of being learned? But interestingly, and this will come out more, I didn't realize it was so early, and I'm glad that's why I did the close notes this time around with you, Robert, is that Johan Clematis then claims, if the truth is conceived as something learned, then we presuppose the truth's non-existence. Now, I understand why that makes sense when he will go about refuting the proofs for existence of God, but I'm not really sure that's obvious to us right now. I think we might have to say to our listeners that may become clearer in time. I thought that was I was like, wow, he really does introduce what he's going to do way up front. Mm-hmm. And, but ultimately this set up, this presupposition of the truth's non-existence set up a problem for Socrates, and it can be traced back to the Meno. And there's this particular paradox that Socrates knew, and he ultimately tried to resolve it through recollection. And that paradox was this, that one cannot seek for what he knows, and it seems equally impossible for him to seek for what he does not know. For what a man knows, he cannot seek, since he knows it, and what he does not know, he cannot seek, since he does not even know for what to seek. So, I ask myself here, is it obvious that's how saying the truth can be learned sets up this paradox? And we might want to think on that for a second. I've got how Socrates handles that with recollection, but, I don't know. Do you think it's obvious why we get this paradox, that if the truth is something that can be learned, it presupposes its non-existence, and then we get into the situation where we don't seek. If we knew that we knew the truth, we wouldn't seek it, and if we didn't know the truth, then we wouldn't know where to seek it. I guess for me, it didn't seem obvious how that automatically connoted that the truth. That by saying the truth could be learned, that its non-existence was presupposed.
Well, if the truth can be learned, then there must have been a time when you didn't have it. Is the kind of the basic way I understand that. So if it's and he relates this later on. It becomes a little more clear when he talks about when we come into being, when we were never here, not in being, and then we come into being. There was a time when we didn't exist. The fact that we came into being makes us realize there was a time when we were not in being. And so it's just kind of the same paradox. Meno had a lot of paradoxes. I don't know if you've ever studied Meno. Some of his paradoxes, they're just wonderful. They're really thought-provoking. And this is kind of his style here. He kind of puts you at both ends of the extreme and then draws a conclusion from it. So yeah, I can see this as a tension, that there was a time when I didn't know the truth. If I claim that I can be taught the truth, then there must have been a time when I didn't have it.
Right.
Otherwise, I always must have had the truth. And so, like you said, this doctrine of recollection is Socrates' way of kind of skirting around the issue and saying, well, you always had it, you just didn't realize it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something about it that goes a little too fast for me. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so it makes it seem like you either have the truth or you don't. And I always it seemed like to me that whatever truth is, we don't really even know how truth is defined here. That
well, we
it
know
could,
that, we know
it could emit of degrees,
yeah.
and I guess that's why.
Kierkegaard is bringing us to a different point, but you're absolutely right. The truth has many different facets to it, many different ways to look at it. But he's bringing us to that truth of the moment. So for him, truth is actually, and we'll find this out, I'm not sure if it's in this work, but indirectly it's in this work, I think, the moment that we confront with God. That confrontation between us and God, that's the moment of truth that he's really talking about. He's not really talking about some of the other things that we might consider truth.
Right.
But this is where he's going with this anyway. You would agree?
Yeah. Totally. And maybe I need to go back and revisit the arguments for the Meno. I mean, he proceeds pretty quickly here. So maybe I need to go back and look at that. But, so you mentioned how Socrates handles this issue with his doctrine of recollection. I've got another quote here from the text that will help us understand what this doctrine of recollection is, and Bob has helped us a little bit already, but it just is all learning and inquiry is interpreted as this kind of remembering. One who's ignorant needs only a reminder to help him come to himself in the consciousness of what he knows. Thus, the truth is not introduced into the individual from without, but was within him. So, if the truth can be learned, and I don't know where to seek it, I just really need to have sort of a teacher to ask me enough questions that make me look inward and rediscover the truth that was latent within me all the time. Right? Is that kind of how you understand that?
Yeah, and this is really, I mean, it took me a long time to come to this as to why did he open up with that idea and how does that relate to idealism and so forth. And what I get from it is that if truth, he's trying to say that if Socrates is right, then truth is something we begin with internally. We already have it.
Right.
But if Socrates is not right and it's not from within, then truth must be from without.
Right.
The idealists believe truth is something that we have within us. I mean, it's a mental idea. It's an idea that we have that is truth. So in a sense, that's the connection to Socrates that I wasn't able to get.
Yeah. Now I see it because, I mentioned earlier, we did the seminar with Graham on with what must the science begin. And it is that truth is already within in sort of pure consciousness with pure being. And I can see how the germ of idealism is there.
Okay. And not the conclusion, but the problem with it is where Kierkegaard is going to say that means that the historical Christ is really unimportant because that's a historical truth. And as we go into idealism, we'll find historical truth really doesn't matter. And that's what all those philosophers that I read all had in common, that historical truth didn't matter. It was speculative truth, philosophical truth, truth of reason that really mattered.
Well, that was driving everything, and the speculative truth, depending on how you read Hegel's system of religion or whatever, that is the thing that is legitimating the religion, not the other way around. That can be sort of argued or whatever, but you read some quote from Hegel earlier, right, where he said that Christianity was the highest religion, but then his philosophy went beyond it.
Yeah, his philosophy is the highest philosophy.
Yeah, so Christianity is like the last. It's the last skin the snake sloughs off before we have like pure truth. Right.
Okay.
So it's a very important snake skin, but the real snake is the Hegelian circle, the snake eating its tail. So, yeah. Snakes. Interesting. A lot of snake stuff here. So what's interesting about this idea, the Socratic idea of recollection, is that he says that Socrates, and we've debated about what was Socrates and what was Plato, and I have to do more research on this, but at least in Greek consciousness, that this gave credibility to the idea that the soul was immortal and of its preexistence, which is pretty cool in a way, right? Like, if you're certain, it kind of makes sense why Socrates and the Delphic temple and everything like that was imploring individuals to know thyself and to say that the unexamined life is not worth living. Ultimately, one discovers, if you like, maybe one of the reasons, and I'm just speculating here, maybe one of the reasons why it becomes so important to lead and examine life is so that you can kind of get back in touch with the most primordial truths that are buried within you. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Through self-reflection, I guess, or through the means of the teacher, which is what we're going to do here.
Right. Right. So yeah, and Kierkegaard says that if this is the case, right, that the truth is within, and it only needs to be sort of recollected with the help of a midwife. What happens? The highest relationship that men can have to one another is to do kind of precisely what we're doing with one another, right? Where we ask each other questions and we sort of precipitate introspection, so people can find out these things for themselves. That is, if a divine point of departure is given. And Socrates, his life was very congruent with this idea. I mean, he went around acting as a midwife, not just to important people, but to people in the market. And he felt like it was his divine mission, like that he, and if he didn't do this, he was going to be cross-examined by the God within. Interestingly to note, though, is that Kierkegaard says that as much as Socrates may have been like this, may have conceived of himself as like this, who knows how Socrates really thought about himself, but if he was like kind of on this divine mission, that didn't mean that he's like better than anyone else, right? Like that when he was inducing people into aporia and getting them to do this self-reflection and to try to do the recollection, he as a teacher was a mere vanishing moment. And I think Kierkegaard here says in this first section of About Project is that, Socrates could induce these sort of questions, like a servant girl could do this. Mm-hmm. Like the teacher is not to be like this godlike prophet person in your life that you idolize. They're just merely an occasion for you to go deeper within yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's no more than that. And it actually, if anyone tries to do more than that, right? If you and I were to get up here and try to be like, to give say today's election day, right? So like, if you and I were to get up here and say, well, obviously the moral thing to do is to vote for Jill Stein or Gary Johnson or Trump or Hillary Clinton or whatever else, like we would not only would we be bad teachers, but we would be bad friends, right? Like, because we're trying to like kind of like co-opt this like sacred process that the individual has to engage on for themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and not only that, like if anyone did that, like Kierkegaard says they would be entering into idle chatter if they tried to go beyond just merely questioning what we believe and why we believe it. So the individual, on the Socratic view, and it's a quote, in the Socratic view, each individual is his own center, and the entire world centers in him because his self-knowledge is a knowledge of God. And I guess you can see how you could get to systematic philosophies if you just keep going and going and going, trying to figure out what it means to know thyself. So, I mean, but Johan Clematis wants to pump the brakes on the Socratic doctrine, this theory of recollection, the immortality of the soul, the pre-existence of the soul. He kind of thinks that it's largely of historical interest to him, but and he says this. He says, my relation to Socrates or Prodicus cannot concern me with respect to my eternal happiness, for this is given me retrogressively through my possession of the truth, which I had from the beginning without knowing it. So whatever the truth is, and this is as far as I got today, it's going to be something that is acquired by our own search. Now we don't, we had at the beginning what Johan Clematis was up to, the distinction between objective truth and subjective truth, and the nature of the searches for those things. But we'll probably get deeper into those issues as we go along. That's all I've got for today. I know I think I may have promised in our last seminar that I would get further, but life is very busy these days. So, but I think to be honest, we've probably been talking for almost an hour anyway. So I think we probably have a lot of good content here. Is there anything you want to discuss or maybe bring up that I perhaps glossed over?
Well, just right at the end, we talked about the teacher. I just wanted to comment before we leave that I have it in my notes. I call him the difference is the accidental teacher. Whether it's Socrates or a servant girl who helps one recall, the truth doesn't matter for the teacher. For the teacher is not essential for the truth. And that was one of the things of Socrates. And that's why he was very humble. He was a very humble man. And Kierkegaard compliments him for being humble because he didn't see his role as implanting the truth, but only as kind of a non-essential role, as he's just the midwife, just the one who asks the questions. He undermines his skill there a little bit, in my opinion, but nevertheless, that's the role that he takes. And that's what it was important, because he develops this idea of the accidental over the essential. I'm not quite sure how to define accidental, unless I would simply say unessential. Would you? In his works, he uses this word a lot as well, accidental. He never really defines it, as far as I know. Would you say accidental is synonymous with unessential, or is there a different way?
Or inessential?
Inessential, yeah.
I mean, I think the thing is we haven't talked about the foil to the accidental, right? And we have to get to the point where we get some more of the vocabulary to flesh this out. But it seems like we can all sort of follow the Socratic example, and it's really contingent who is playing Socrates in our various lives. I mean, someone may be turning to us right now as a Socratic sort of figure.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, but then, as you intimated, like that is if the truth can be found within. Right, that if it can be recollected, that if the foundation for German idealism is correct by assuming that we can have this we can rediscover this point of pure being, mm-hmm. and then develop systematic philosophy out of it. Now, I have to read further to see if Kierkegaard uses essential in this way, but if that view is false, if Socrates was wrong, or it got as far as he could, and we find out that truth is introduced from without, we have to ask who's doing that introducing, and because he's bringing it from without is more essential, and what makes him more essential? What is he teaching us that Socrates never could teach us? So I think what makes Socrates an accidental teacher is that anyone can do it, and is historically contingent. But if the truth comes from without, we're going to see that there is and I think it's in the philosophical fragments where he talks about necessity, that not anyone can do what the other kind of teacher is going to be able to do.
Yeah, I like that definition. That's great. That's good. That fits very well.
I mean, I'll have to revisit it, but that's kind of my hunch for right now. And, it's an evolving sort of seminar discussion. And the way that I view these things for the Noetic app is that, we might have to go back and update these, and we just kind of hope that people go on the journey with us.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's what I got for today. I can probably get some more done soon. We can talk off air here in a second about when we'll get together again, see what our schedule permits. But if you don't have anything else to say, I want to thank everyone for listening to our initial exploration of Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. It's great work, and I hope you explore other things on the Noetic app, which you can get for your iPhone and Android devices. Bob, you want to say anything in conclusion?
No, I enjoyed doing this one, and I'm look forward to the next one.
All right. All right. Take care, everyone.